All right, guys, welcome back to the Adaptations Fitness Podcast. Today, I have Brian Miner on the show. For those of you guys who do not know Brian, he actually recently became a coach with 3D Muscle Journey. So if you guys are familiar with Eric Helms, who have had on the show a few times, Brad Loomis, Jeff Alberts, Alberto Nunez, he's now a part of Team 3D MJ. He also has his master's degree in health and exercise science from Colorado State University. Is a certified strength and conditioning specialist from the National Strength and Conditioning Association, which is basically like the highest personal training certification you can possibly get. Those are the guys that train in the collegiate weight rooms and deal with training halls. So a pretty big deal. Brian also has a ton of experience, both being a high level powerlifter and a natural bodybuilder. So I guess I wanted to just thank Brian for coming on, and yeah, you guys are in for a treat today.
Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So I wanted to get right into it, and basically, you had a good article series, I believe, which is basically going over why higher intensities are better for strength. And so I figured it would be a good idea to delve a little bit more into that. With my platform is mostly like I train a lot of powerlifters, and in my whole coaching philosophy, the thing that I like to modify the most as lifters progress is actually intensity, and with certain like programming strategies and whatnot, which we might be able to get into as well. But could you, I guess, dive into the relationship between, I guess, like the roles of intensity versus volume when it comes to strength training?
Yeah, I think first it's both of them combine to provide the stimulus, but I think regardless of training goal, volume can just sort of be considered like the dosing of the total stress. So when it comes to training for strength, I think higher intensities do tend to provide better outcomes, and we can get into the reasons for that. In a broad, looking through like a wide lens, it's like they're more specific. It's a higher degree of specificity. But why is that? What types of adaptations are lending themselves to promote higher, like strength is in and of itself is not like a physiological adaptation. It's like an expression of multiple adaptations. So some of these adaptations just respond more favorably to higher intensities. So but volume is still important. We need an adequate volume of work for dosing that stimulus. There's depending on the adaptation that we're trying to seek, there's going to be a minimum effective dose for the each one individually. And it's not something we can pinpoint on a map, but I think looking at like the effective stimulus range, it's good to think of it like on an individual adaptation basis to some degree, because what may fall below an adaptive threshold for one adaptation might be perfect for another. And so there's different points in time where you are biasing specific adaptations where volume and intensity are going to be manipulated. So like for hypertrophy, for example, we can grow with pretty much any practical intensity people normally train at, 30% all the way up to 100. But looking at it from like a set to set basis, usually it's rep ranges between like 6 and 30. When take it, especially with those higher rep ranges taken close to failure, will provide similar hypertrophy outcomes. So with all of that being said, like the higher intensities, below like a 6 RM are still going to provide like a stimulus, like a mechanical tension stimulus, obviously, but it's just you would have to equate that, like think of it as like tension area under the curve, so to speak, and adding sets helps fill that in a way. So it becomes an issue of practicality, I think, with hypertrophy and higher intensities, where if you're doing sort of the conventional powerlifting style training, which I think for most people, is like low to moderate rep ranges. And of course, it's going to depend on the phase that you're in. But with lower rep ranges, there's a time where they're not going to be the most efficient for hypertrophy, and I think can be suboptimal in the grand scheme of things if you're looking at it from like a macro cycle perspective, because lighter and or you it's just an issue of longevity at that point. I think if we were to just accrue all of our volume with high intensities, we'd be pretty beat up. And so I think a lot of it is sort of connective tissue and joint management to a large extent, and just an efficiency perspective when you're trying to build muscle, which I think is that's a huge component of strength. That's one of the physiological adaptations that helps express it. So it's mostly like, okay, where that article series was coming from is, in the research, when they compare different intensities and look at strength outcomes, it's usually over, a relatively short term. So like, why are higher intensities, like if you had 6 weeks to peak for a meet, why would higher intensities be more advantageous in that time frame? Whereas, an argument could be made if you look across a training career, the average intensity would be significantly lower, since a lot of that is probably going to be steered more towards muscular development in between meets and further out.
Yeah, so I know that actually, like Greg Knuckles, he also has a really good article kind of on like intermediate powerlifters and beginner powerlifters, and how like a lot more of that training time should probably be in more towards the volume of the component with more hypertrophy. I also have talked to Eric Helms, and he says that because I guess I want to ask you this because you mentioned periodization, and Eric and the research has basically said that for intermediates, it's in advanced lifters, a daily undulating format of periodization tends to be slightly better. So in that block periodization or that undulating periodization design, I know there are some coaches that like to keep in singles year round for that. I know Eric is become a little bit more fond of that. I am coached by Eric Bodhorn, and he likes to not given singles very much until you're about 3 or 4 weeks out from a meet, and usually we do other rep ranges. So how would you sort of periodize your intensity using like a DUP setup?
Yeah, so the use of heavy singles, I think when we look at some of the downsides of that, or some of the perceived downsides of that, they're just considered subjectively is very difficult and like high stress. But when it comes to different elements of fatigue, like there shouldn't be, despite common belief, like they're not highly centrally fatiguing because they're so short duration in nature. Like volumes and higher rep ranges, close proximity to failure, that's going to be more centrally fatiguing than like a conservative single, like an 8. So I do still use those. I mean, I think it also kind of depends on the psychology of the lifter. There's people that just enjoy, getting a little bit closer to their top end strength. And I think for the majority of my programming with the powerlifters that I work with, it's the bulk of their stimulus is going to come more from like the volume work. It's not necessarily the top sets, steering everything to a large extent. I think they serve a role of maintaining proficiency at high intensities, and there's some people that can take time off from doing heavy singles and come back and feel right at home, and there's other people where they get under the bar, and if it's 20 kilos more than they've ever had in training, it's it can be pretty daunting. So I think that plays a role, but the majority of the training stimulus is going to be driven by like back off work whenever I program singles. But I do think that the other advantage of them is, the heavier the weight, the more accurate, the prediction of like estimated max will be. Like a single at an 8 is going to be more reliable than, set a 4 at an 8 if you're trying to estimate a 1RM. And so from a diagnostic perspective and sort of assessing the effectiveness of the program, I think they can serve a valuable role there. But there's also nothing wrong with doing doubles, triples, sets of 4. And I think if we're looking at like an undulating pattern, if I'm including top sets, let's say bench, for example, I might have it be, a start where my, say I'm doing 3 days a week of an undulating pattern for like bench. So my top set on like the higher volume day, maybe like set of 4 to an 8. On kind of the moderate volume, might be triple at an 8. And then on the heavy day, it might be a double at an 8. And then from there, I oftentimes will like increase RPE by 0.5, and then at the end of the block, usually they're coming close to hitting like a single at an 8.5 or 9. And sometimes we might repeat a specific protocol, but even on those like higher volume days, like the set of 4 and 8, like all the back off work, maybe sets of 8. It might be like if they're far out from a meet, sometimes we might not include a top set on that day. We may do something like a top set of comp bench and then do close grip to sort of steer some of the volume, or a dumbbell press if we're in a more like developmentally focused stage of the macro cycle. So there's a lot, like I think DUP, and I know Mike Zordos has talked about this, and I know Eric has as well, Helms, is I think it can kind of be looked at as like daily undulating programming, and that can be included like really in any phase of a periodized plan. If you were to look at like linear periodization, you could still have like a daily undulating programming model within each week. You could 12 weeks out, you might be focused more on hypertrophy, and it might have a pattern like 10-8-6, and then maybe it's 8-6-4, 6-4-2, as you kind of progress. And so there's a linear theme there, but it's still daily undulating in nature. And I think a lot of that for advanced athletes, if I had to suspect the advantages there, some of it could just be fatigue management too, because generally some of those heavier sessions are a little bit lighter in volume. So being able to have like a lower volume session that's sort of biasing intensities can give you a break. And on the flip side, like lighter days can give you a break in terms of connective tissue. So I think it's I think it's more an issue of, or a benefit of, managing fatigue. And I guess the term fatigue there would be like, in a practical sense, could be used to describe anything that's present that could be masking your performance, that if it wasn't there. So like connective tissue discomfort be like a big one. Like it's not like fatigue by definition necessarily, but if it's present, it's going to impact you. So that's something, I guess when I talk about fatigue management on a broad level, that's sort of I sort of put that under that umbrella. But things like muscle damage, central fatigue, peripheral fatigue, that's more acute, like all of that, different training strategies and modalities are going to influence those to varying degrees. So yeah, I think, does that answer the question?
Yeah, so basically, and obviously, like that's a tough question to ask on podcasts, especially. But I think you did a really good job. Essentially, a lot of it's going to be driven by your goals, where you're at in your macro cycle design, heading into a meet, how much muscle that you need, and then like it's like obviously if you're more intermediates, well, probably will make a little bit more sense to definitely, maybe not do like as heavy of top sets as frequently, because, staying a little bit, further away, maybe you're still incorporating like a triple or like a set of 4, could be, it's still probably good enough. And if you have like a linear component anyways to it, you're probably going to eventually end up at singles over the macro cycle. So usually like I find that sometimes like the argument for singles year round is like, well, it makes the transition phase a little bit easier. And I think yes, and I think no. As long as I think there's, if you're going from like 5s to like sets, like singles, there's probably going to be more of a lag time, whereas opposed if you're going to triples to singles, and like I wanted to know like what your opinion was on. I tend to think that the intensity component is even more important as you get to be more advanced. And I think there's a reason why you do see more and more advanced lifters pushing intensity a little bit harder year round. And usually that's because, like what you said, they don't have they are probably are more close to their ideal weight class, probably, pretty, have a decently long training age. And I know that Ben Esgro has the opinion that it's a lot of it is neurologically driven at that point, and less
Mhm.
so muscularly. And I'm a little bit more biased towards that, whereas I do especially think that for more of the beginner and intermediate guys, they do tend to look at the top guys and they fail to realize like, well, what did they do to get to that point? They only look at like what they're doing right now. And most of the time it's like they were training with lots of volume, still doing
Mhm.
SPD, but a lot of it is just like learning how to train like a bodybuilder. And that's a lot of what my programming is like, honestly. Like whenever you're like, how do you train? I'm like, I incorporate squat, bench, and deadlift, but I mostly do bodybuilding.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that that's a good point, and I agree with Ben, in the sense that I think what's driving that ceiling up at that stage of a training career probably is mostly neurological elements. Um, but and I think I wrote about this in that article series for JPS on why high intensities are better for strength. But when I look at it like from a practical perspective, the if if we're focused like, okay, higher intensities are going to be moving that needle primarily at that stage. I think the issue then can become like just connective tissue integrity for a lot of people. So it's like, okay, well, what if we're um, if we're pretty much near max, or if we've accrued 95% of our muscle mass that we're going to naturally, it's like the question can be like, okay, well, why are we spending time doing higher volume work that's focused on bodybuilding when that's not really moving the needle? And I think that's a fair question, but I think you also have to consider the alternative there, where it's like, okay, well, the alternative would be using high intensities, for the majority, like your average intensity being high year round. And on paper, that may move the needle more, but I just find that these more submaximal loading phases are still going to be important for a lot of advanced athletes still. And so I think sort of the role of these volume phases may change to some extent as the lifter progresses across their career, but I do think they're still important. These lighter phases of training for advanced athletes, because I think a lot of you talk to most advanced lifters, it's like their bottleneck for progress is oftentimes like injury, and so it's managing that long term and being able to sort of cater to the longevity aspect of it, so that when you do focus on these high intensities, you have some runway to work with, and you're able to build up there. So um I think that the ratio between, let's say, to simplify, like volume driven and intensity driven, it may bias intensities a little bit more at advanced stages when I program, but I think the more submaximal stages, getting away from the big three even from time to time, I think can be still have its advantages in the big picture.
For sure. I definitely can attest to. I do tend to notice that after like the peaking phase, it's like I can notice I can push intensity pretty hard for about 4 weeks, and then if I try to do that again, usually I start to get like some like I have an issue with like a strained lats that I has like
Mhm.
flares up every now and then. I have an issue with my pec minor. No courtesy of you, but sorry, dumb joke. Pec minor.
It went over my head until you mentioned
Yeah.
it.
With like when I bench press, or like say like my shoulder might get a little bit unhappy, and it's usually after I've been pushing intensity a little bit harder. And so that's why, like, I do think that working on the strategy, like ultimately it's like in the long run, like we can always talk about, like why this is theoretically possible on paper, but because we're not closed systems, we're not machines, we're not robots, we have lots of different things. And like what you said, like if you're having joint or connective tissue distress, that's going to, we don't know the exact mechanisms yet because pain is complex. That's going to probably decrease neurological drive from your central governor.
Exactly.
So like if you're in pain, that's probably not ideal for training. Like for example, I was dealing with like a pretty bad like pec thing on my meets back in April. And I kind of just knew, like, I just told Eric, I'm like, dude, if I just match what I hit last time, I'm going to be happy. And like on my third attempt, it was like, it looked easy. Well, I was like, I almost blacked out because it hurt.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of it does really could come down to fatigue management. And I think that everybody should be really like open and honest about that, and like know like when it's time to, like, some people can push the intensity year round, but it tends to be a very specific person. Like I know Chance Mitchell, for example, pushes his intensity hard year round, especially on deadlift, and he just responds well to that. Whereas like for myself, it's like that's good for like one block, and then I start to get flare ups.
Yeah.
So I guess I wanted to, so now we've kind of talked about the relationship between volume and intensity pretty well here, and that volume is still going to be the majority of our stimulus are down sets, or if we're doing a top set down set approach. And with something I usually tell my lifters is use that top set to set up your down sets.
Yeah.
I think that helps reframe the purpose of a top set. Especially if I have a load drop, sometimes I will make it so that they will not be able to survive the down sets if they overshoot.
Exactly.
That will be a good test, or I guess BS detector. But I guess I wanted to go a little bit into the morphological adaptations as to what exactly happens when we are pushing higher intensities that do make it better for strength.
On the morphological level, I think the primary ones are going to be related to connective tissue. I mean, we have the biggest morphological adaptation that's going to contribute to strength is going to be hypertrophy. Like it's going to correlate, I think, the most with strength there, but hypertrophy isn't intensity specific really. So that's not really one of the morphological benefits of higher intensities. It has more to do with like tendon stiffness and lateral force transmission, and being able to efficiently transfer force that's generated within the muscle to across the joint. And so I think it's kind of an overlooked. It's hard because it's like I'm not an expert on connective tissue physiology by any means, but it seems like, okay, high intensities, they are beneficial from like a tendon stiffness perspective, but there's a fine line there where it's like, okay, well then if you push it too hard, like I think it's more like a convenient side effect of the benefits of training at high intensities for neurological reasons. It's like I would never program high intensities specifically to address connective tissue adaptations necessarily. So it's because I think that could be a recipe for disaster for some people, because higher intensities oftentimes are, if there's something pre-existing there, are going to be more uncomfortable for connective tissue. So it's that has to be sort of taken into context with the individual, but there is evidence to suggest that higher intensities lead to more favorable connective tissue adaptations for force transmission.
It made me a lot of sense, because like for example, you have somebody who's like a bodybuilder, you try to have them like a single, it's like they always first thing that they complain about is, this is really heavy, my joints hurt. Powerlifters, who are say you're at 80+% year round, you're going to be a little bit more, your body's going to adapt a little bit better. And actually I know that like there's like some anabolic steroids that do actually act on the connective tissues to make them stiffer, which also is why some of them are better for strength. Which is pretty interesting. So I guess going from morphological to neurological, I'm assuming this has most to do with Henneman size principle.
I mean, there's a number of morphological things that are going on, or neurological, excuse me. I think when we use the term like neurological efficiency, it's sort of an umbrella term looking at um, our ability to activate the pool of motor units available to us. So as you said, like the size principle, for the most part, like the very few muscle, like I think the quads, for example, um, like voluntary activation is still pretty low compared to smaller muscle groups, just because there's so many more motor units that innervate, the quads than say like a biceps. So, but training with higher intensities does increase your ability to recruit more. But it's relatively it's still I don't know if that's what's driving the majority of it. Um, I think a lot of it is more to do with like coordination, and promoting like rate of force development, rate coding. Like rate of force development, I think is pretty interesting in the sense that higher intensities tend to be better for that, like the time it takes to reach peak force. And so training at higher intensities, it's like if you reach the most demanding phase of a lift where the force, the torque demands are greatest, it's like we usually fail a lift because we either don't hit that speed with enough velocity, or we can't sustain force output long enough, or we're just simply just not strong enough at all, like we just get stapled. So being able to generate force quickly can help sort of grind through those sticking points, and I think training with high intensities is going to be advantageous for that. So I think when it comes to the neurological side, it's the other thing to consider, like when we talk about coordination between muscle groups, there's going to be different proportions of relative contribution depending on intensity. So like you're going to squat differently at 70% than you do at 100. So it's getting yourself used to that, we call it like coordination profile at that intensity can be helpful. So yeah, I think agonist activation, rate of force development, rate coding, coordination. Those are the big ones that all sort of fall under that pool of like neurologically efficient at high intensities, and that's like where specificity, like that's what it's kind of referring to. Like higher intensities are more specific because they are promoting the adaptations that support using those loads.
Sure. And I like what you said about agonist activation, because so anybody that does not know, like you just take like exercise science courses, like basically you have two types of muscles. You have the things, you have agonist and antagonist muscle groups. So for example, in a squat, the agonist muscle group would be like the quadriceps, and the antagonist will be the hamstrings. And in beginners, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but there's lots of beginners have a difficulty of like isolating like the agonist, and basically there's like co-contraction.
Yeah, there's a lot more co-contraction.
And basically more advanced lifters are much better at recruiting. They're just they're agonists, like they're quads. Obviously the hamstrings will still play some role because they will help out with other things in squat, like the small degree of hip extension in the squat.
Well, and there's a degree of stability. Like you don't want to remove all antagonist activation.
If you had like no hamstrings, you would just
yeah. So yeah, they play a role there. But you're right. I think novices tend to have a greater degree of antagonist co-activation when they train, and with more experience, they're able to kind of shift that ratio a little bit more, favoring the agonists. But it's not like you shut off the antagonist like that.
That's impossible.
That either, so.
So awesome. So I guess just to wrap up this conversation on why higher intensities are better for strength. What are the main takeaways that you would like listeners basically to have here? We went a lot into like everything and a pretty broad like over sweeping view. If somebody wants to like actually apply this to their own training, how would you go about somebody maybe? Because obviously programming is you can know all the science, but a lot of it is an art, and individualization is a key component. So how would you individualize this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it depends on the individual's training status first. Like that's kind of the first pit stop along the way of deciding this, I think, is, are these individuals, like, do they have muscle mass? Like, or are they, like, I see a lot of beginners that are, like you said, that see these, top level USAPL lifters, training with high intensities, more regularly. And the other thing to keep in mind too, for people that, are watching them, is usually, like, most people aren't posting their back off work. It's like I think people see like heavy top sets and yeah, they assume that's like, okay, this is what their program is. But I know a number of, high level powerlifters that are still doing, sets of 8, so it's not that it's, I think they have, if anything, maybe more regular exposure to top end, like 90% above or 85% above than maybe someone, with a lower training status. But for someone that's just starting out, like you'll often see people that will, like, they really focus on just the big 3 early on. And I think that's another, like, they're not the most biomechanically friendly lifts in many cases, or I should say there's more, especially depending on, the individual's hip structure, their leverages. They're usually, when it comes to hypertrophy, like the big 3 aren't my first choice. Like there's oftentimes more conducive options to individual structure, things that have, a larger range of motion that can be better for hypertrophy. So, for most, like, novices, I think it's important to still get some exposure to the big 3. But I would, if I want to throw out like an actionable ratio here, it's, I would still say 80-ish% of your volume should be coming from movements that are, or say 2/3 of your volume should be coming from movements that are more intended to drive hypertrophy than strength. And I think the strength element, like, you're going to get stronger even if you don't back squat, bench and deadlift. Like if you took a raw beginner first day in the gym, you had them max out on the big 3, I mean, it'd be ugly looking. But then if you took them through 4 years where they didn't touch a barbell and that you retested them, it's like they're still going to be significantly stronger. They would have added hundreds of pounds. So I think it's easy for people early on in their training career to start introducing some of this higher intensity work and seeing their lifts go up, but assume like, okay, this is what's primarily driving this. And I think early on development is driving as much or more. So yeah, I tend to try to get novice powerlifters or people, that are, say somebody that's not even a powerlifter that's like, okay, I want to bring up my squat, but my goal is more, bodybuilding. It's like, okay, let's focus primarily on the bodybuilding side of things, and we'll dose the high intensity stuff appropriately for your level of proficiency and experience with that movement. So but then as you progress and the neurological element starts to steer more of that, like on an acute basis, I think shifting, that ratio a bit, maybe it's more like 50-50, rather than 2/3. Like, I don't have any lifters that I've ever worked with where it's like I'm only having them squat, bench, and deadlift. And that's mostly because, like, we still want to maintain the muscle mass we have. There's better options that are less, I think, psychologically demanding in many cases. But
I think
also,
that's a huge part of actually like the fatigue from the big 3 is just the psychological component, because like
I think that's the
if
big
I'm
part.
if I'm getting, I have like, like, even though like I've been deadlift over 700 pounds, when I still sleep at 95, I'm still like, okay, like it's like it's psychologically stressful.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at like like an RDL, I'm like, this is fine.
Yeah, exactly. And even if like, I think the psychological element, like I would sort of put that under that umbrella of fatigue too. It's like if there's apprehension there that's masking your strength capacity, like that's something you want to address, you
Yeah,
know.
I've had listeners like throw up and then have like a 9 on like going into like, or even like on meet day, and like that definitely does play into how well they can perform.
Mhm, absolutely. Um, what was I going to mention here?
The psychological component of why um like basically like
Oh yeah. This was a bit of a
I've
tangent
seen,
here because
yeah.
I was just talking to one of my um, prep athletes about this earlier. Bodybuilding prep.
Mhm.
I think sometimes, like in a bodybuilding prep, we look at strength progression um, in the off season. Is like that's probably, as natural lifters, that's probably our best proxy for muscle growth is progression, in strength, like improving your performance across moderate rep ranges. um
Your hands, it's milligrams.
what's that?
Your hands, it's just milligrams, and
Yeah. So it's like it, yeah, exactly. Like it's progressive dosing.
yeah.
So um but yeah, the I think in a contest prep, it's hard psychologically for a lot of people. If there's anybody that's done a bodybuilding prep in here, I think it's a useful, I guess, useful experience and anecdote. But I was talking to a prep athlete of mine earlier today about the psychological element of different lifts, and I think when it comes to like the tail end of a contest prep, that's like one of the biggest elements of mental fatigue for me personally. Like the diet is hard, but like getting yourself in to train, like getting under a bar to squat, like one, like your leverages, range of motion, like your technique has changed. Like usually the squats feel pretty bad at that point, and so there's just better alternatives from a mechanical standpoint, but also you want to be doing movements that you're not dreading, I think. And that's something that I think can carry over into powerlifting too. Like if you feel anxiety when you're going into the gym because you're squatting so much and you're in discomfort, like just because higher intensities and the squat might be more specific at that point in time, there's like that may not end well, for you if you try to kind of force it when usually when there's mental apprehension, it's can be related to discomfort, just fatigue in terms of, in the case of prep, just being really lean. um but I think the managing the psychological element in terms of programming is something that probably doesn't get talked about quite enough. um and I think that's, especially when you look at it from like the lens of like a whole training career, and you're not always going to be doing what's optimal on paper, because like you said, we're not closed systems and we need to manage. Training for 20 plus years is going to take, like it needs to be an enjoyable process more often than not to keep someone going that long and building their total in that time. So yeah, I think that's a topic that probably deserves more attention. I think naturally a lot of people kind of figure that out, but maybe not acknowledge it. But I think that's a big thing that I try to think about with people, whether it's in powerlifting. I think there's sort of this notion. It's like, okay, well, I'm a powerlifter. I need to be doing like high frequent. Why am I not benching 3 times a week? It's like, oh, well, you're 6 months out from your next meet and your shoulder was bothering you. So
Yep.
it's
Yep.
like that. There's things like that you need to account for and be dynamic with. And um, so it's hard to give like solid recommendations outside of you know get a vibe for how your athlete's feeling, or if you're doing your own training, ask yourself, like, am I enjoying training? If not, like, how long has it been like this, and is it worth swapping this out so I can, you know especially like if you're far out from a meet and you're focused on more hypertrophy and less specific lifts, like
And you
there's
want
a
to
lot of
be
leeway
healthy.
there.
You especially want to be healthy for prep so you can actually push
Exactly.
when you need to. Like the 8 weeks out period is like Okay, like it's go time, like let's push and stay healthy. But if you're nursing an injury because you've been going too hard in your off season, man, you're
Exactly.
probably gonna have a tough time peaking.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So you mentioned a lot about muscle gain and how that's important. So I guess I wanted to go into sort of nutrition and optimizing body composition as a powerlifter, because I do think that I think the really cool thing about powerlifting is that you can essentially be quote unquote wherever you want to be as long as you're within your weight class. You can be 20% body fat, you can be 10% body fat. And most of the time I do think most powerlifters are probably around that 15 to 20%. But I wanted to ask what your opinion is essentially on the role of body composition in powerlifting. Essentially, like how lean should you get? Is that more so like an individual thing / preference? Because for example, I always maintain around 8 to 12% year round. It's not that hard for me. It's just where I've been chilling. You have guys like Charlie Dixon, for example, they're always very, very lean. And you have other guys like Jonathan Keiko and Ashton Ruska are probably more like at the 20 to 25% range. And obviously, like I think that's probably a little bit more. What I've observed is that basically lighter weight classes, like basically if you're age 2.5 or less, you tend to be leaner because that's what you need to be in order to be competitive there. Whereas when you get to, especially as a natural, usually above 90 kilos, you tend to have a slightly higher body fat percentage just because of natural limits of musculature. So I guess I want to know, I guess your opinion first on body composition, like leanness for powerlifting, from both a performance and injury management perspective, and then essentially how you might work with a powerlifter over their training career to optimize their performance based off of that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question and a good topic. I think obviously I think the biggest thing is where can you hang out, like at what point are you, like once you get below a certain settling point, it becomes difficult to maintain that and train productively. Like you said, 8 to 12%, like that is leaner than average, if you look across like the population of powerlifters. But like you said, like you have minimal issue, like you're used to being that lean, and so
years. So
yeah, so somebody who's there's obviously endless different body types in the sport, different limb lengths, segment lengths, different fat distribution. I think that's an interesting topic, I think, because like again, sort of going back to like bodybuilding to sort of provide some different framework for this. Performance in a prep is going to go down. You're going to be significantly weaker in compound movements at the end of a contest prep than you were in the beginning. And I think people, and I touched on this earlier, when we're gaining in the off season, we tend to look at performance as like our best proxy for muscle growth. But the same isn't necessarily true on the way down. Like performance, yeah, if it's staying intact, that's a good sign. But if it starts to go down, like that can be related to a number of things outside of muscle loss, because there are so many significant changes occurring. And I think body fat is a big part of that, and technique and stability. Like added body fat around a joint can affect different range of motion. At the bottom of a squat, someone with giant quads that's has a lot of muscle with a good bit of body fat as well, like they're going to have more like passive force contribution at the bottom of a squat than if they were leaner, even if they maintain the same amount of muscle. And you'll see that too, like fat distribution, like in a lifter's midsection, for example. Someone who has like kind of male fat storage patterns. Like I have like the epitome of male fat storage. So it's like in bodybuilding, like my glutes can be striated before like my lower abs come in. So
Sergio has said like you are like, this person has to be like sub 8% to have your abs.
Yeah. So he always gives me shit about that, but it's true. And there's people that are, like you look at average, female, that it's sort of the opposite. It's like they tend to lose lower body fat a little bit later than I may. And so yeah, I think it's that needs to be taken into account, because it's where kind of that threshold is going to differ, I think, largely based off of that. Because if you lean out in your midsection first, it's like you may have less stability like at the bottom of a squat, but it may not affect your bench that much. So it's one of those things where, but bench is also notorious for being one of those lifts that tends to take a hit with cutting weight, a bit more than others. And once you get to a certain point, and I think a lot of that is like range of motion. You just have less girth front to back, and so there's just less stability there. So I think body fat distribution does play a role there. But and rather than like thinking in terms of percentages, I think the most, I think, reliable indicator for people is there a point, if you've dieted in the past, is there a point, like a threshold or a range, like plus or minus 5 pounds, where below that you just start feeling like shit? There's going to be that point for a lot of people. And for me, it's like strength will, I could be similarly strong at 90 kilos as I am at 95 or 96, but once I start drifting kind of into the low, that jump between 90 to like 88 would be much more noticeable for me. And I think some of that is just due to, it could just be due to where you're losing that body fat to a large degree. So I think the role of body fat in strength is it's not really a topic that's discussed that much, but I think it does play a significant role, in terms of passive contribution to force output, and range of motion and things like that. So
do you think it has any impact on your ability to recover?
I think yeah, it could. I mean, we know, like, when you diet, your rates of protein synthesis are going to go down. But I think, yeah, there's sort of that threshold. I mean, that certainly plays a role, but there's a significant drop-off point, I think, with that. There's like a middle ground that I think most people can sort of play around in and see little to no differences in strength. But I do think, like, yeah, recovery, if you're getting significantly leaner than you're used to being, than where your body wants to be, then yeah, the recovery aspect could be impacting your ability to, progress and provide, an overload stimulus. So yeah, that's certainly a role, and it's not any one single factor. But I do think, looking at like DEXA data, and granted, I mean, no body composition measuring is perfect, but looking at DEXA data of, someone like in a contest prep, like, yeah, they're going to lose some lean body mass, but it's oftentimes not as much as people expected.
Is it mostly just in like glycogen storage and like,
yeah, and that's a big part of it. Yeah, so it's hard to really, you can't really get at, like, with 100% accuracy, like dry muscle mass, so yeah, I think, or at least I'm not familiar with a method that does it. So I'm not an expert in that area either, but yeah, autopsy. So that's one of those things where recovery is going to, like, as you get leaner, yeah, your recovery is going to be playing a downstream, role in your ability to apply a stimulus. So but I think when you're looking at, like, talking about, I think that's probably more of an issue, like people dropping weight classes, probably, than people sort of, okay, where do I need to hover within a weight class? Because I think if someone naturally finds themselves in the middle of a weight class, the weight classes are narrow enough, I think, in most cases, where I would hypothesize that the recovery element isn't playing as much of a factor when operating within a weight class, because it's not going to be like massive swings in body fat, and it's also rate of fat loss is going to be playing a role there. If someone's getting leaner but they're losing 3% of their body weight per week, like of course the recovery aspect is going to be playing a larger role there. So with powerlifters, I'm a big fan. Like if someone's trying to come down in weight, or increase their dots, or whatever, trying to go down in weight class, I do like pretty conservative rates of loss, even if they have a decent amount of body fat to work with, and that's mostly so they can just it's not like a radical change in the way these lifts feel. It's a more gradual adjustment. Whereas, if you have a bodybuilder and, running a mini cut in the off season, it's like you can be a little bit more assertive there and not worry about compromising muscle mass. But I think the slower rate of loss in powerlifters lends itself to maintaining some of that coordination aspect and not, okay, well, last week, I'm having to lower my belt a notch, every 2 weeks. Like that's going to feel miserable. Um, so yeah, that's one thing to consider. I think if you're trying to drop weight is, pay attention to your performance. Like if you're losing at a rate, between 0.5 and 1%, and I would even sort of err on the side of 0.5 percent of body weight per week. If you're doing that and your performance is staying intact, then I mean that's really all you can do until you get to the point where, okay, well, now I sort of feel like I've crossed this threshold where suddenly things just feel out of whack, where these lifts just feel foreign to me. Like that probably means you've sort of pushed beyond that threshold. And I think that's probably a more reliable way to go about it than saying like, okay, you should, be a certain body fat percentage, because that, like I said, with fat distribution patterns, that's going to impact people to a largely varying degree.
Yeah, and everybody has different, selling points or lower
Exactly.
intervention points. So I guess just to wrap things up, I want to ask about muscle gain, because I basically is your approach to having powerlifters move up a weight class, like for example, me, I'm basically hovering between 188 to 190, so I'm like right smack dab in between 8.5 and 90 kilos. Are you more so like the bodybuilder bulk and cut thing for powerlifting, or do you like to keep it like more so like that very slow like weight gain upwards, maybe
Yeah.
that half to 1% per month?
Yeah. I'm if I were to pick one, it would be the more conservative rate of gain. I try with powerlifters to minimize or even eliminate like off-season dieting phases if possible. Like especially if you're going up a weight class, like you have a little bit more body fat to work with, I think there's still going to be like, even if you were to maintain, like I think people are under this misconception of like, in order to be making any forward progress, you either need to be maintaining weight or sorry, gaining weight or cutting, like we have to cut in order to be able to gain. And I don't think that's with most powerlifters probably the best way to do it, because there's going to be so many variable swings. Now, granted, if it's a we're talking like 2-3 kilos, that's a little bit different. But if someone's like wanting to go up a weight class or go down a weight class, I would rather see them do it conservatively rather than, if they're going up a class, gain, 3% of their body weight, or gain, a pound a month or a pound a week, sorry, and get there and then have to cut. Like I think the advantages lie in being in the surplus on the way up there, and there's a point of diminishing returns for that anyway. It's not like your recovery, it's not going to get better past a certain point of a caloric surplus. You're just going to get fatter, and so I think that's something to consider. Is like there's a maximal rate we can really even gain muscle mass. But that being said, we talked about body fat. I think most people, if you took their same body mass now, or lean body mass or muscle mass, and added 10 pounds of body fat to them, they probably would still be stronger at that heavier weight from just the body fat, and so I think there's going to be advantages there too, but the best thing to do would be like if you're at the same body comp that you're normally performing at with, you know 3 extra kilos of skeletal muscle, like that's going to make a noticeable impact, so and I think if you're doing that, like a conservative rate is good. I try to avoid, like, if people are doing lifts that are really reliant on, coordinated effort, like a free weight movement, it's like constantly bouncing between body weights. It just seems to be more unreliable, in terms of, or I guess unpredictable would be a better word for it, in terms of what to expect with their training. Whereas if they're just in a small surplus, 150 calories, a day or so, it's like they might, like, they're going to have some runway to work with there. And it's funny because people in gaining phases, like there's few people that actually do that. Like you'll see people in gaining, it's like, okay, well, I'm bulking, and then they just kind of loosen the reins completely. Whereas like if they're cutting, they're very,
Right.
diligent with everything. And so I think it's sort of an art for people to be able to manage their nutrition in a surplus in a way that allows them to gain at a very conservative rate as a power lifter.
Yeah, so like my approach with lots of my powerlifters and myself is like I'm happy to have a similar opinion. Just that's kind of like what I do. I'm like, okay, like let's have slightly higher calories. Like I'll add in 200 calories above like what they have been eating.
Mm-hmm.
That affects their performance. Obviously, we keep them around their 10,000 steps a day, whatever. So that energy expenditure is relatively, as consistent as we can manage. And then basically I'll have them just, probably body weight will go up a little bit over time. And then I'll have them just keep training and keep training there until we feel like I'm not recovering as well as I once was, or
Mm-hmm.
I look a little bit more flat at this body weight. And that's probably a sign that muscle has been gained, maybe some body recomp, and then we'll kind of just repeat the process. But usually I find that is a solid, like probably 2-month time period,
Mm-hmm.
like really productive training. And just like having to diet and knowing that you have to diet is a psychological stress. And then like, because I've had people ask me like, oh, you're so lean, what if you gain body fat? I'm like, well, I probably would get a little bit stronger, but I also know from like past experience, this is where my body's pretty happy at.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's the biggest thing.
no point in pushing
Yeah.
myself outside of that, just in the name of potentially adding 1 more pound of muscle,
Mm-hmm.
5 pounds more fat.
Yeah.
That I'm not going to like anyway. It's not going to be psychologically okay with. And I'm probably like, I do this thing where it's like I'll gain like say like 5 pounds, then like I kind of like don't track for like a week and I lose like 2 pounds.
Yeah.
Just like it's just kind of like what happens. But sort of like the whole like learning how to eat around like there's a difference between like performance dieting and body composition dieting. Like
Mm-hmm.
a bodybuilder, I know 3DMJ does like to like have like their massing phases for like 6 to 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's similar for like powerlifters too, though, even, but maybe a little bit slightly like less conservative, because I know Berto likes having, a pretty like, okay, we're definitely in a surplus here, like around 300 calories, but that still is not like crazy. That's not going, that's a bagel on top of
Yeah. Yeah. And most people, when they think like surplus, they think, okay, I need to start like
today
eating.
I have a gallon of milk.
Yeah, I need to carry around my gallon of milk.
There are people in my gym that do that, and they definitely have gained 20 pounds in a month. Holy crap. But yeah. So anyways.
Yeah, someone in your position, like you're a really good example. Like someone who's operates well, both in terms of, their day to day and their performance at a, leaner body composition. Like there's really no advantage of
like not like
like if you're going to gain, it's like gain conservatively, like there's really no point in doing it trying to race to the bottom of the next weight class.
Because like all I'm thinking of is like, well, the point of me moving up weight classes to be a better performer.
Exactly.
So I want to eat to support my performance. My adjustments are around that performance. I feel like crap, I'm not recovering, or if I feel really flat and depleted, and like I just don't have this oomph in my training, I'll make a change. If I feel fine, there's no reason to change anything, especially because like probably a really good indicator of how fast you're probably gaining muscle is how fast your performance is actually increasing. And for most people beyond that beginner stage, man, it's just slow. Like I tell lifters, like I'm on a 5-pound PR. I'm on a 5-pound PR. Like what? That's what I'm like. That's really good. Like just like if you could be at 3 times a year, you add 7.5 kilos to your total. You do that for 10 years. That's me going to like a 1K total.
Yeah.
That,
I remember, I think it was Matt. I've heard that example before, and I think it was from Matt Gary.
Yep.
And I've used it a lot because it's true. It's like those, and if you're in this sport for the long run and you're kind of playing the long game, like you need to learn to appreciate those small PRs because they do add up considerably.
Yeah, and like even just like ability PRs, like hitting the same weight but it was half an RPE or doing like 1 RPE easier.
Exactly.
And that's also probably like it's still high intensity, like going back to the earlier discussion, but like it might be a little bit more like sustainable and that's still like measurable progress. Like it doesn't also be adding load to the bar, and it'll also be your ability to just express strength, which is by lower exertion.
That is one thing I've done in the past where in my own training is like I'll use, like I have a velocity device that I use, and I don't use them much with like my athletes because most people don't have them. But one kind of fun way I've gone about progressing movements in the past when I do feel a little bit beat up maybe, and I'm more apprehensive in like how frequently I'm increasing load is, I might keep my top set something, that's I know I could hit on any given day, and then just look at average velocity across the set and like see is that going up by the end of the block, and usually it is, and then it's a more graded exposure by increasing loads less frequently doing that. And so looking at technique and our subjective difficulty and bar speed, I mean those are all things that I think as powerlifters we sort of forget about. We look at it like, okay, if I'm not adding weight to the bar, then there's no progress. And it just hasn't been unveiled yet,
For sure. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Where can people find you if they want to work with you potentially?
You can, like you said, I recently joined 3DMJ. So 3dmusclejourney.com /coaching is where people can learn about what we have to offer and apply for the coaching. So, and then if anybody, has any questions for me directly, I'm not great about getting back to DMs, but I usually do. So if you want to DM me, I can respond to those as I see them.
Awesome. We'll have all those in the show notes or for all those details. And again, thank you guys so much for listening to the Adaptations podcast. And I'll talk to you guys in the next episode.
All right. Thank you.